Before I came in, we were having a discussion outside, and I ended up talking about the fact that we are implementing multi-factor authentication with one of my clients, and everybody understands MFA is a really powerful control, and it's quite obvious that we need to get it out there. It's become foundational over time, but it's a first world control. And what we've realized in trying to deploy this across Africa is a couple of things. So, for example, in South Africa, people staff who travel in taxis are really nervous that their phones are going to be stolen. So they tend to leave the smartphone at home and take the oldest functional phone that they can with them in the taxi, which means that when you want to deploy Authenticator, you just can't do it. Another case that we've come across in Nigeria, I didn't understand this until we were trying to deploy MFA. In Nigeria, you don't have consistent network across the country. You have pockets of networks. So when guys travel around with their phones, they take more than one SIM card with them, or more than one phone with them, which is entirely understandable until you're trying to deploy MFA and you're trying to send a message to an authenticator. So the reason I mention all of that is because you can see the presentation I put together is called Holding Mercury, and it's about what it means to be a CISO and the kind of complexities that we have to face, and also a view perhaps on how you need to think about this. And then right at the end, I do a slide on the Cyber Crimes Act. As Stephen mentioned, I have co-authored a book on it, which is the second edition is going to come out from Juta a little bit later in the year. And I do know most people are not yet familiar with it, so maybe it's worth just delving into it. Also, I would prefer us to have a discussion. So if you've got questions or comments or disagreements, let's do them up front and have a conversation. Okay, so why are CISOs holding Mercury? Well, firstly, there's lots of stuff happening. Everybody talks about change, of course, but we're going through an unprecedented evolution at the moment. So firstly, there's legislation. Everybody knows about papaya. When I talk to my clients, not many people talk about RICA. But RICA's been around for, 10, 15 years, and everybody in this room has to adhere to it. Don't think of it as a cell phone body of legislation. Not many people know about cyber crimes. So the negative issue there is that if you're a CISO, if you're in the security space, you suddenly have to start thinking about the law in a way that you never did before. The positive to this is that your audience out there also is starting to think about the law. And I've seen this. I've seen people become more sensitized to privacy. Every time there's a breach and we hear about it, people are starting to talk about, is my data out there? Am I with TransUnion? The irony is that I am with TransUnion. I have the identity protection package. Then there's resource shortages. A couple of years ago, Cisco published a paper, I think it was, and I say a couple of years ago, this was probably about 5 years ago, where they predicted that globally there was a shortage of about 2 million InfoSec staff. And in South Africa, that's even worse. In South Africa, we have the brain drain. And if we didn't have the brain drain, we've got the education system. And without being too provocative, I think many of us know that people will arrive at the workplace straight out of our education system and not have the skills to do the job. The implication of that is that the technology becomes really more important, because there's a lot of things you can't do with staff who are untrained, but technology is dramatically improving, and it's filling that gap in a way that is significant. The thing is, we also think about security. We've always thought about servers, we've thought about virtualization, we've thought about endpoints, thinking about cloud. But there are new shifts coming, and there are shifts that we've not had to deal with before. So everybody in the room, I'm certain, has seen the videos of the cars that are being hacked. I drive a Jeep, and yeah, Jeep's hackable. If you work in the SCADA system, you've got to think about IoT. And the issue with IoT, and we're already seeing it out there, you've probably got IoT in your house if you're running inverters or anything of that nature. They're inherently hackable because generally they have very little security. If you're in the security world, and some of my clients have got warehouses and transport systems, this kind of stuff, IoT is very much a reality. So we can't just focus on traditionally what we've dealt with. But the real shift is to mobile. And I'm quoting here from Scholl from Orange Cyber Defense Research. The issue with mobile, I talked earlier about multi-factor authentication. MFA is really powerful. MFA makes a huge change. And the bad guys know that. And so if they're going to continue breaking into systems, they need to overcome the cell phone. And the big spend, especially by nation states, is on cell phone security. Right now, we think about mobile management. We put some technologies out there. But we still do things like allow people to bring their own devices. We still don't put lots of policy out there and controls to make sure it's done in a specific way. That will change radically. And we will become less open to allow people to do what they want because we can't afford it. And then, we've seen ransomware. We're seeing breaches more and more often. They're getting a lot of press coverage. Perhaps what we're not seeing is the extent to which ransomware has become a business. So let's take Conti. I'm certain everybody's heard of the Conti ransomware group. Now, Conti is not one group. They are a collection of different capabilities. They have different departments. So they will have an area within the group that goes and identifies a target and finds vulnerabilities. They will have, within the group, individuals that will go find the data, that are lateral movement specialists. They will have within the group individuals that will look at the data and will look at the company's balance sheet. And then will work out what ransom we can ask if we expect to be paid, if we want this to be successful. And then they will have a separate area that actually runs the ransomware attack itself. And these groups communicate with one another. And if you track the communications between the groups, you get a sense of to what extent they think of this as a business. And not only that, but to what extent they disregard the impact that they're having on the businesses that they hit. That's why I say there, the triumph of indifference. There's often a little bit of amusement there about the fact that guys have got weak controls, how easy they are to take, how much we can take them for. After the events in the Ukraine started, we saw real politicization of security, or rather of insecurity. So I mentioned Conti before. Conti came out quite early and said they support the Russians and they are going to attack Ukrainian or aligned stakeholders. And we've seen real state sponsorship increase. So the issue is you need not be directly in the line of fire here, but if you're in a business which might provide resourcing in the event of a struggle, of a war, you become a target. And we've seen the shift to cloud. So the shift to cloud is positive and negative. The positive side is if you choose the right cloud organization, these guys spend a lot of money and they know what they're doing. And it can be very difficult to break in. One of my clients, we've just done a penetration test with a really well-regarded white hacking team, one of the best that I know. They were unable to break through the defenses. Eventually, they managed to do some social engineering to get a user ID password, but they were unable to come through that perimeter. If you choose the right cloud partner, you've got a strong partner, no question. If you choose the wrong one, it's not quite the case. And equally, I have seen cloud relationships where there was little to no security in place, including things such as backups. I'm thinking of one case that I went through about 2 years ago, a company that had outsourced their IT and security to a cloud company. They were taken in a ransomware attack, and it took them weeks to recover because their backups had been hit as well. The bad thing as well about the shift to cloud is that it doesn't matter where you put your information, you are still liable. It doesn't matter if things go wrong, particularly in terms of the law. If you have a breach and somebody's data gets stolen, they're not going to look at the cloud company, they're going to look at you. And then finally, one of the things that are really positive, I mentioned this early, the rise of real technologies that can assist you. If you're working in a medium to large organization and you are tracking the number of scans, the amount of phishing attacks, the number of attempts to log in, you are seeing thousands daily, thousands. You can't do this. You can't, especially when it comes to APTs and you're seeing long-term attacks. You can't track this unless you have the right technology. Technology is hugely beneficial. Another reason why I think, being a CISO is like holding Mercury at the moment. So let's take the case of asset management. Anybody that's ever read an information security standard, the first thing they say is know what assets you have. Yeah, anybody here that's not seen that. But the thing is, so yeah, I've got from extracts from ISO 27001 and NIST 853, and both of them are saying the same thing. But here's the reality. The guys that write the standards don't always appreciate what it's like in the real world. So if you're saying you've got to know all your assets, here's the assumptions that you're making. You're assuming that the organization sees information security as an asset management stakeholder. So when we think about assets, we're going to include information security. Yeah, right. That the CISO has got sight of and participates in the process of procurement, disposition, and retiring of assets. That the organization has centralized control. That the organization has consistent asset management procedures, and that everybody in the organization adheres to those procedures. Can anybody in the room say that their organization does this? So there's no way on the planet. I've never worked in any company where they've had absolute control of the assets that they had procured, let alone shadow IT. So you're always in a situation where you're dealing with some of the unknown. You're always in a situation where stuff is going to go wrong, and it's not entirely in your control because there are limits. Unless you have absolute control of the organization, which the CISO doesn't have, there's stuff you just can't do. And when I started putting this presentation together, I was giving some thought to complexity. So we've already talked about complexity. The thing is, what's the relationship between the complexity of systems and security? And I ask that because think back to what we've just said. We've got IoT coming. We've got massive growth in infrastructure. We have got a shift to cloud services. We have got complexity growing at an exponential rate. So you would think that provided you throw more resources at the problem, that you're actually going to be able to overcome that. So I didn't know the answer. I went looking. I did come across this specific research paper which talked about the issue. And the research paper says the following, that that's true for a while. Systems get more complex, you have more money, you have more resources, you can address the problem. But you get to a point where complexity overwhelms you. And I think that's also true if you're the guy at the center looking at dashboards, getting all this information coming in. Eventually, the more information you get coming in, unless that information is managed very discriminately, unless you have intelligence behind those systems that are telling you what to look at, you will not know where to go. Those systems are improving all the time. But it also means that you, at the center, if you're the CISO, to fulfill that role, that requires some EQ, it requires a lot of vigilance and a lot of energy. You can't just leave it to the systems. You are center point here. You have to decide what matters and what doesn't. But you can't do this in today's world without the technology to help you. So the thing is, we're seeing that stuff's getting more difficult and more complex and more overwhelming. But where are we? What's happened in the security industry? Okay, so these graphs I've got here are all from within the last year. If you look at the top left-hand one, I assume everybody knows who OWASP is. This is from OWASP.org. This is a look back at the application security risks landscape between 2017 and 2021. And if you look at that list, there's not a hell of a lot of change there. There's 3 new security risks, but the other 7 are still there. They haven't changed a hell of a lot. And if you look at those top ones in 2021, broken access control, cryptographic failures, injection attacks, insecure design. Anything new there? Anything we didn't know about 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Nothing new. And on the top right-hand side, okay, so this is these are American numbers, but I don't think South African numbers are better. How long does it take on average to patch systems? So across these various disciplines, you're talking 3 months. And everybody in the room that's had to deal with this knows that lockdown made it worse. Especially in small organizations where people would say, we don't have bandwidth, we don't have the ability to download these patches. Mika Hipponen said in one of his blogs that the first virus that he came across, called Brain.A, came out in 1986. It's 36 years ago. And we're still grappling with the same stuff. We still haven't solved it. And there are lots of reasons for that, but the point is, InfoSec still is a bolt-on. We'd like to think we're part of the architecture. We would like to think that we get included in every phase of design and implementation. And that's true in some organizations, but very few. InfoSec is generally a bolt-on. And the type of CISO that you have also influences the way in which we address these issues. And I'm going to talk about that in a later slide, but not every CISO is the same. We've talked about complexity. We haven't really talked about federation, but companies generally, larger companies, are federated to some extent. And if there are, there's politics in the game. There's always somebody out there saying, I want to do things my way. I want my Mac. I'm not willing to work on your Windows laptop that you give me. And of course, there's budgets. In federated organizations, security is a cost. And in organizations where MDs are held responsible for the bottom line and for that income statement, they don't want to spend. The net result, after 36 years, we are still getting it wrong. The situation's getting tougher, it's getting more complex, it's going to radically evolve over the next 10 years, and we haven't solved the problems that we had over 30 years ago. So what does that mean? It means that we will never be risk-free. If you're in the space where you're managing security in your organization, you already have events, you already have incidents, and you probably have breaches, whether you know about it or not. And there's a reasonable likelihood that if you are having a breach, the cause of that breach is outside of your control. And if you have had a breach, there's almost zero likelihood that you'll be able to identify the attacker or take action against them. Even if the attacker is South African, they're going to launch proxy attacks from other countries, and generally countries where there's no jurisdiction that applies. And here's the problem. Stephen mentioned earlier that I have been in this industry a long time, and I guess you can see it. So I've had the joy of going through a number of different breaches with different clients. And it's the gift that keeps on giving. You think you have a breach and you solve it, you walk away. That's not what happens. What happens is this. It consumes your time. When you know somebody's inside, you drop everything else. It's an auditor's dream. If you're going through an annual audit and they find out you had a breach somewhere along the way, they don't care about anything else. You end up paying forensic investigators, lawyers, and media relations. It cripples you for weeks or even months. And the reason for that is that it's not just a security problem. If you had a data breach, let's think about what Papaya says, you have to identify every individual whose information was breached. And you have to inform them in writing. Now you think about it, if you're a large organization and a server with thousands or tens of thousands or millions of records are taken, what does it take to recover from that? How do you identify all those people? How do you even know if they've been breached? You know, a ransomware attacker comes in, they don't leave logs behind so that you can work out what happened. They delete them as they go. It puts you under the microscope. Because you might have a board that understands that these things happen on an ongoing basis and you have to manage them as best you can. But you can't possibly have a board that says, we had an attack, you are in charge of security, you are to blame. And I have seen CISOs and ISOs leave their positions and move to other companies very soon after attacks. And there's also an opportunity cost here. Because while you're focused on the fact that you're dealing with an attack, you're not doing your day-to-day job. You're not securing the organization. You're chasing stuff in a very narrow area that was exploited, but you're not necessarily thinking about the bigger security issues. So what I'm talking about here, there's, with this entire session is going to talk about technology, and technology is really, really important. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about if you're a CISO, and these are things I've come across in my own experience, there are things that perhaps you don't think about or you are sort of aware but people don't necessarily talk about or they don't want to discuss. But these are some of the realities that can change the way you secure the organization. So the first thing is, CISOs are not all the same. I mentioned this earlier. You get guys that are very technical. You get guys that are very risk-based. You get guys that are, as we said before, you get guys that are so technical, and I can name a couple in South Africa. They'll go to B-sides conferences. They'll go to DEF CON. They will write position papers on how to launch an attack, but they won't know how to speak to the board. They won't necessarily know how to get funding. They won't know how to manage a breach. They don't know how to interact with risk or audit. And because of that, however good they are technically, they are ineffective at addressing the business problem. And on the same side, you'll get guys that came out of risk or guys with very weak technical skills or guys that are political. I've seen that too. They really know how to sell security within the organization and know how to speak to the board, but they don't understand technology. And they don't understand what they should be looking at. Point is, whoever you have in that position is on one or other side of that median to some extent. And however you're going to run security within the organization, you have to address both. And so if you are a CISO, you've got to look at yourself and say, who am I and how do I bolster my skills? or if the CISO reports into you, you've got to think about that. You've got to look critically at them and say, are you the guy to solve the problem? And if you're not, what do I need to do to get you there? Then policies. Has anybody ever been through an audit where you didn't get an audit finding on policies? No. Because auditors are always going to say, these are the policies you need to have. Do you have them? Have you updated them? Can I see them? But here's the reality about policies. We have to have them, we know that. But you create a policy, it's actually not a small undertaking. You've got to, first of all, find out within the organization, how does the organization think about things? You can't create a BYOD policy without working out, is the organization going to buy devices? Does the organization agree in principle? Do we need mobile devices because we've got business processes that are written to include them? So it's not a technical decision, it's a business decision. And you've got to lobby and you've got to talk to lots of people and find out what has to happen. And then you've got to draft the policy. Then it's got to go around and get signed off and people have to approve. And then you have to publicize it and you have to train people and you have to implement it. It's not a small initiative. And you've barely got there when it's time to review the policy. And in all of that time, there's been an opportunity cost. I've been at organizations that have 20 or 30 policies, and you say, how many have you implemented? And the guys look at one another and nobody quite answers. And I'm willing to bet that 80 to 90% of the people in the room are in that type of an organization. So what are we doing? Are we chasing paper so that we can keep an auditor happy? It's not your job. Our job is to secure the organization. So when you think about policies, have fewer rather than more. Have what you absolutely have to have. Keep them thin. Don't chase policy, and rather take the audit finding that you don't have the policy than not secure the organization. I have said that to auditors. That has not made me popular. I've also seen this a lot at clients. I've said repeatedly, you have to utilize tech. Tech is really important. But what happens in the real world is guys go through the year, they don't buy. They get to the end of the budget cycle. Now, they don't want to have to answer to the fact that they've got unspent funds in their budget, so they buy. And now what? They haven't budgeted to train anyone. They haven't quite worked out an implementation plan, so they put it on a shelf somewhere. And I've seen technology sit on the shelf for years, not inexpensive technology. If you're going to buy, because you need to, use this stuff. Again, be more discriminatory. Think carefully about what you're going to do. And then one that is so obvious, I can't believe that I have to say it, but I have had to say this to more than one client. Monitor every day. You've got dashboards. They're not there to be pretty. You need to understand what is happening in your organization. If I had to tell you, I know of, he's no longer there, he was a CISO in one of the largest banks in South Africa. Never did this. Never got feedback from his team on where we are. Could not tell you what his patch numbers were. Could not tell you how many UDP scans he had. Could not tell you anything. Never did this. Then one that's not often spoken about. Everybody talks about external intelligence. You need to know what's out there. You need to know what CVEs are coming. You need to, has the landscape changed? But people don't really talk about internal intelligence. Internal intelligence is when you've created enough strong contact within the organization. So when things go wrong, you know. You're not just getting it from your dashboards. You're getting it from people phoning you to say there's something gone wrong here. You're getting it at 4 o'clock in the morning from somebody saying, I need to access this system and I can't, and something is going wrong. And when you really need this is when it does go wrong. When you need to say, what is the impact? These servers are down. We've had a breach. What's the impact to the organization? And every IT department is going to have prioritization lists, and they'll tell you what's on the server. But the business will tell you. The business will tell you what the impact is to them. And that information is critical when you recover. And I mentioned auditors before, more than once. Auditors will ask you that. The audit expectation, and this is a fair expectation, is that it's not just the IT department that is solving the problem. The organization has to solve the problem. So you need that internal intelligence, and you do it by creating strong internal networks. And then finally, attack is the best defense. You don't sit and look at dashboards and make sure that compliance doesn't just on its own solve the problem. And I'm going to give you a specific example that I gave the last time we gave this presentation. So one of the clients I worked with a couple of years ago, we were doing phishing penetration tests. Not penetration tests, sorry. We were sending out internal phishing attacks, and we were seeing what the take-up rate was. First time we did that, we sent out roughly 11,500 internal phishing mails. And this was a number of years ago, so I've got to think back to the numbers, but I think I remember them correctly. That the first time we did that, we had 367 staff members give up all their credentials, everything. Now imagine if you're running an organization and there was a real phishing attack, and suddenly 367 staff had given up everything. You wouldn't know who the attacker was. You wouldn't know who was signing illegitimately or not. Doing a password reset across the organization would not help you, because the attacker would get the message and change the password. It would be catastrophic. So we knew that. And we repeated that phishing simulation 6 times over the next year. And every time that we did it, we made life tough for the guys that had clicked. We made them go on training. We informed their management. There was a policy change inside the organization that if you had repeatedly did this, you could go down to written warning or worse. The last time that we did it, we went out to over 13,000 users, and 7 people clicked. And the point was, we had to aggressively go out there. We knew this was the biggest vulnerability in that organization, and we had to take it head on. I've got one more slide. This is the one about the Cyber Crimes Act. If you're not familiar with the Cyber Crimes Act, you can see on the right-hand side here that there are elements of the Act which talk about individuals, and there are elements of the Act which talk about organizations. And I need to make a distinction here, because people will think about cyber crimes in the same way they think about papaya. It's not the same thing. In papaya, you have a regulator. The regulator's job is to make sure that your constitutional right to privacy is protected. Something goes wrong, the data subject can complain to the regulator, and the regulator may or may not do something about it. And let's just think about the regulator. The regulator is not an unlimited, huge office. If I remember correctly, they have about 8 people working in the office. Their own strategic document that they published on their portal about 6 months ago showed that in this year they expect to get 400 complaints. So they have limited resources. And if a TransUnion happens, they dedicate a lot of the resources there. So the point is, if you have a privacy breach, the regulator has limited powers, they have limited capabilities, and I'm not saying that you don't have to worry about this, of course you do, but you need to put it in perspective. Papaya says you're going to have a fine of 10 million rand, or you're going to do 10 years in jail. You're not going to do that. We've seen TransUnion, we've seen ABSA, we've seen others. Have you seen anybody go to jail? Have you seen any major cases? You have not. That's not going to happen. Those conditions apply if you actively go out of your way to, you've had a breach and you go out of your way to prevent being investigated, undermine the regulator. But cybercrimes is different. It's different in the name. It's a crime. Cyber Crimes Act says, in essence, that the crimes that you can perform in the real world, you can now perform in the digital world. Cybercrimes is different because there is no regulator. If you perform a cybercrime, this gets taken up by the police services. It comes with jail time. And here's where it gets tricky. when we think about, this is where it's similar to papaya. Cybercrimes pertains to a person, and a person means a natural or a juristic body. So it's not just the individual, it's the individual or an organization or a governing body or a school body or whomever. Section 2 of the Act, and I need to prefix this, there's a lot of debate going on about this specific section because it is quite provocative, it has not been tested in court. But here's what it says. Any person who unlawfully and intentionally performs an act in respect of a computer system or a computer data storage medium, which places the person who performed the act or any other person in a position to commit an offense, is guilty of an offense. Let me put that into English. If you as a manager put one of your staff in a position where they can commit an offense, and you do it unlawfully and intentionally, and they do commit an offense, so do you. Let me give you a specific example. Papaya says, let's take Rika. Rika says, you can't monitor indirect communications without a system controller in the organization giving you approval. Let's say you're a manager in an organization and you think that one of your staff is sharing confidential information on a Gmail account. So you say to IT, do me a favor, I just want to see what their mail is, outgoing mail is to Gmail. And that staff member does it. Both you and that staff member are guilty of a crime. And when we break it down, I see some guys are really puzzled. Because it works this way. Rika says, the Constitution says you have a right to privacy. Yes? Everybody agrees. Right to privacy includes the right not to have your communications monitored. Everybody agree? Makes sense, yes? But you in an organization, you have the obligation to look after the organization, your stakeholders. So you should have the right to monitor. Everybody agree? Yes? But how do you do that? Rika says you can't monitor unless somebody in the organization takes accountability for it. That person is called a system controller. The system controller is the person that says this individual may monitor that communications for this period of time, for this purpose, only for this period of time, and if we go to court, I will stand up and defend it. That makes sense, right? Somebody has to represent the organization legally. Somebody has to take accountability to make sure this is done lawfully. We all agree. So think about the example that I gave. The example I gave was that a manager thinks that something's happened, doesn't go to the system controller, on his own jurisprudence says to somebody in IT, just get me his Gmail messages. The manager has broken the law because he hasn't gone to system controller. The staff member who does it has broken the law because he hasn't got approval from the system controller. And in terms of the Cyber Crimes Act, it is a crime. It is a crime. It can be reported to the police. You can end up in court having to defend yourself. And look at that second line of that table, interception, imprisonment, and a fine, imprisonment anything up to 10 years. I hear a deathly silence across the room. I give you that as an example only. That is the end of my presentation.